Well, good morning, everyone. It is always an honor to be introduced by Vartan Gregorian, and Madam Secretary, it's always an honor and a pleasure to sit on the same stage with you. Our topic today, advancing global peace, has certainly never seemed more urgent or more complicated, given the intersection of some really powerful dynamics. A much more competitive geopolitical landscape, transformative forces like climate change, the revolution in technology, and the massive migrations of peoples, and not least, deep uncertainty about American leadership. It is certainly enough to keep my nostalgia for diplomacy under control. But maybe, Madam Secretary, we could begin by asking you to describe some of the lessons that you learned about peace building from the remarkable women that you profiled in the terrific new book that you wrote with your daughter Chelsea, the Book of Gutsy Women. They include elected foreign leaders with whom you work closely, like Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and remarkable American profiles in political courage, like Senator Margaret Chase Smith. So what do their stories tell us about peace building?
Well, first of all, thank you, Bill, and thanks to Vartan wherever he went. He and I have been friends and collaborators for many years. And before I talk about the Book of Gutsy Women, I want to thank you, Bill, for writing your recent essay in Foreign Affairs about the brutal assault on diplomacy, and in particular on the State Department and career foreign service officers, based on your very relevant and long experience. We wrote this book, the Book of Gutsy Women, for a number of reasons. One, to share stories about women who have inspired us that we admire, and kind of compare generationally how we came to these particular choices because we had different experiences growing up. When I was a little girl, there were very few women who worked outside the home that I knew of. Chelsea had a different experience, so we kind of came together to join forces to write about 103 women. There are several overall characteristics that these women share, even though they are separated by, in many cases, hundreds and thousands of years. There are a few fictional characters, obviously many historical, and some contemporary ones as well. Number one, their determination to persevere in the face of obstacles, threats, attacks, setbacks, and not only for themselves, but for their purpose and their cause. And for many of them, it's almost unimaginable what they endured. But nevertheless, they not only persisted, they did so with a sense of optimism that they could be part of making the change, seeing the progress that they believed was needed. And for some of these women, they faced a lot of the conflicts and personal suffering that we're now seeing in the world. You mentioned Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the first woman elected president of any African nation, beaten, arrested, exiled during her time trying to figure out what to do in the midst of the horrors of the Liberian Civil War, or Michelle Bachelet, herself arrested by the Pinochet security forces in Chile, her father also being arrested, an Air Force officer being, killed, dying in prison, her mother also being arrested, she being, after tortured, being exiled. But both of them believing in the fundamental human rights that motivated their careers and their opposition to the forces of darkness and oppression that they dealt with personally. So I think that for me, especially at this time, reminding ourselves, learning about people, and in particular women who might not always have as high a profile historically as they deserve, understanding what it took for them to try to make peace, to try to promote and protect human rights, to try to have a new invention or new scientific breakthrough or new athletic record, I think should give us some hope and some optimism ourselves in the face of, as you rightly say, the many problems we currently see.
Well, and one of those many problems that's certainly in the headlines today, Madam Secretary, is the unfolding tragedy and the conflict between the Turks and the Kurds right now, and the U.S. decision to stand aside in the face of that. We've wrestled with the issue of Syria, as you well know, since the civil war began in 2011, and I'd be the first to acknowledge that we got a lot of things wrong. But this all looks, to me at least, like a massive betrayal of a partner who bled for us in the campaign against ISIS, of anything resembling a coherent policy process, and a betrayal of common sense about our interest in keeping ISIS down and keeping the Russians, the Iranians, and the Assad regime at bay. So how do you think this is going to end?
I don't know, Bill. You rightly summarized where we are, and it's not as though these were unpredictable consequences. Anybody who spent 10 minutes looking at the problems, or even better, involved in a process to try to decide what to do, would have laid out all of these issues that are now at the forefront. And let me just break this down for a minute, because the best I can tell looking at it from the outside, and Bill knows these processes very well, is when you make a consequential decision, like you're going to withdraw American troops, or you're going to, for whatever combination of reasons, stand aside as Turkey conducts an air and ground force invasion, you want to think it through. And none of that happened, the best I can tell. This was apparently a personal decision without much, if any, consultation with anyone who could have sounded an alarm or at least put up a yellow light of caution. And it seemed to have been connected to a phone call with Erdogan. And, these phone calls are becoming more and more consequential in trying to figure out what's happening in our whole national security, foreign relations strategy, or lack thereof. And so what we don't know is, was there any information other than just some kind of impulsive desire to gain what I think was thought to be at least a short-term approval for getting American troops out without any regard for consequences. So there was no process. And, process can be given a dirty name, but certainly in my experience in the State Department, process can also be a very disciplined endeavor that forces you to have to look at all kinds of scenarios and the consequences that would flow from them. So here we are. It appears as though this is not only a betrayal of the Kurds, people who fought with American forces, who were in many ways largely responsible for the actual fighting on the ground, with the loss of 10, maybe 11,000 fighters, to drive ISIS out of Syria, and also the role that the Kurds in Iraq played in driving ISIS out of Mosul and Iraq. So they had every reason to believe that they were acting on behalf of not only American but Western interests in trying to dislodge the Islamic State. And they did what they thought they were supposed to do, only to be left to the mercies of not just the Turkish military, and I think this is an important point, but Turkish-supported militias that are, so far as we know already, engaging in executions, civilian casualties, really uncontrolled, violence against Kurdish targets, both soldiers and civilians. It also opened the door to further aggressive behavior by the Russians, It certainly solidified Assad's position, which therefore solidifies Iran's position inside Syria. And with the Kurds now inviting the Assad regime and Russian help to try to protect them from the Turks, it does put us in an incredibly difficult position because Turkey still is a NATO ally. And we have these forces now unleashed in northern Syria and a resurgence of ISIS and the return to the fight by many of the fighters that the Kurds had imprisoned, and most likely even more of the family members of the ISIS fighters who were held in refugee camps being let loose. And I think it's going to be a free-for-all, and with tremendous and terrible loss of life. And so let me just circle back to where I ended with the process. If a president had said to his Secretary of State or her national security advisor, what are we going to do? Because the Turks are, they're going to do something. We got to figure out how to manage this. There could have been a process that would have, I think, led to a possibly better outcome. For example, if the Turks knew that they were being forced into a diplomatic process negotiation, not only with the United States, but with NATO, where they had to also look at the consequences, where they also had to be held accountable, where there had to be some thought given to what has been something of a safe zone up against their border, which they want to rid of Kurds in order to force back into that safe zone the Syrians that are on their side of the border who've taken refuge in Turkey. There are other possible approaches that we could have at least tried to convince them of, but we didn't do any of that. And so now we're going to be once again left with some, really wicked problems.
Yeah, another tough issue on which you worked very hard as Secretary of State was Afghanistan. And there have been significant advances in the last 18 years in promoting the rights of women and girls in particular, but the reality is corruption is still endemic. The Taliban are still a powerful and very disruptive force. It's increasingly difficult to sustain American military involvement. So what do you think is the best way forward there?
Well, I, for one, am glad that the peace talks that the administration was engaged in collapsed. They collapsed for a kind of absurd reason, Trump inviting the Taliban to Camp David, but at least they collapsed. So that was a good outcome of another bad process. We'll see when the final results come in from the recent election. But I think and have always thought it was an absolute error for the United States to negotiate bilaterally with the Taliban and essentially concede to their demand that the Afghan government not be involved. We started the outreach to the Taliban. The late Richard Holbrooke was, adamant about doing that. We actually had meetings. In fact, he died in my office while we were meeting about the latest with our latest emissary who had gone to meet with representatives of the Taliban. So we were well aware that if the United States weren't talking to the Taliban, nothing could happen. But it is a real mistake for us to then not pivot to requiring that there be conversations at the very least at the low level between empowered Taliban representatives and representatives of the government. So I think that has to be rebooted. I hope that once there is a final victor announced in the election, that the Afghan government can begin to be a more robust partner in those kinds of discussions. So that would be my first requirement. There has to be a meeting of the Taliban with the government. Now, why doesn't the Taliban want to do it? Because they don't want to recognize the legitimacy of the government. Despite their, corruption and everything else, they have held elections. And under incredibly difficult circumstances, first under Karzai, now under Ghani. And the goal should be to try to make sure that the Taliban becomes a political party, not an armed insurgency force. And it should be more on the model of what was attempted and partially successful in Colombia, as opposed to some, separation. But one thing that I do believe strongly is there have been advances in many areas. We don't talk about them. They're kind of intangible. They are everything from, keeping Afghan babies alive, going from the worst infant mortality to not great, but certainly improved, to women in school, girls in school, private businesses flourishing, et cetera. So I would hope, Bill, that we come to the negotiation anew with a different approach. And I've talked with Afghan diplomats, I've talked with Afghan civil society leaders in the last months, and they're appalled at what the United States was attempting to impose on them. They all want peace. They would all welcome the Taliban becoming a political entity. Let it compete, in elections. Let it have some positions in government, whatever, but not at the cost of the progress that's been made and the refusal of the Taliban to abide by fundamental human rights, let alone the Afghan Constitution.
That makes perfect sense. Moving a little further east, one of your signature initiatives as Secretary of State was to rebalance American priorities toward Asia. Not so much to contain China's rise as to shape the environment into which it rises. And as you know better than anyone, we have lots of allies and partners from India to Japan who share an interest in ensuring that China's rise doesn't come at the expense of their prosperity and security. A decade after you first laid out that strategy, how does it look today? What do you think we're getting right and what are we getting wrong about managing a very competitive and oftentimes confrontational relationship with China?
Well, I don't know what our strategy is other than imposing tariffs. It doesn't seem we have much of a strategy in this administration, and it's a very difficult problem. It is the classic problem of what happens when a rising power competes with a dominant power. But since we're losing dominance, it may not be a problem to come. We certainly are not inciting much confidence in our willingness to stand by allies, to support partners, or even to stand up to adversaries. So I think that China has to be a number one issue on any administration's foreign policy list, but it also has to be dealt with in a stable, predictable way that sets forth our goals that may or may not be competitive with their goals, and a series of steps that are transparent and very understandable as to what it is we're standing up for and why. So quick examples. When you're Secretary of State, every meeting with a Chinese delegation includes their two absolute demands. No further support for the Dalai Lama and Tibet, and no further support or arms sales to Taiwan. You just expect that. It's kind of like, it's there, it's on the list. They're going to say it, you're going to say what you say, and then you go on and talk about other things. So I was in a meeting with my counterparts probably in 2010, and Taiwan, Tibet, and then they say, and we are going to control the South China Sea. All of a sudden, that was new. And I said, what do you mean you're going to? He said, we're claiming the South China Sea. Those are Chinese waters. I said, that's ridiculous. You're a party to the, law of the seas. We're not, but you are, and, you should be aware of that. And oh no, our claims go back, at least to 1492. And we can prove them because there are shards of pottery and other artifacts that are left on so many of these atolls and these reefs and these, islands. I said, well, that's ridiculous. And, we're not accepting that. We're not even going to talk about that. So that was a new and really important flashpoint, and we stood up against them. We said, absolutely not. We supported the Philippines to take a lawsuit to the International Court to enforce their territorial demands. We've sided with Vietnam and others who were incredibly worried about the Chinese seizing not only physical abutments, but also trying to drill and look for important minerals and other sea-based assets. So I don't hear this administration talk about that at all. And the Chinese are building, airstrips. They're putting military forces all over the South China Sea and all these little, abutments that are sticking up out of the ocean. And that's a huge strategic issue. And we're not talking about it because, we're trying to talk about tariffs on what? Soybeans or whatever it is. I don't know. I'm not against enforcing intellectual property and trying to do something about unfair trade practices, but you need a broader view about how you're going to be dealing with China. This went on. So then this became the talking point. So at one point, I asked the CIA to make, the CIA makes the best maps. If you ever want a really good map, the CIA is great map makers. So I asked the CIA to make a map of the whole Pacific Ocean, showing why we had a right to claim everything. So I brought it to the meeting, because they have a map that is kind of this snaggle-toothy map that they put down on the table and say, see, here's why. So I brought this big, really beautiful map. And I said, we liberated that island. We have a defense treaty with them. And we went through this whole thing. And then, out of, I think, frustration, my counterpart says, well, we're going to claim Hawaii. I said, well, we bought it. Anyway, you have to have some fun in these serious diplomatic negotiations. But I think the point really is there are big issues at stake. The Chinese, Belt and Road project, good for them. They're going to develop, but they're also building ports that they're going to control. And they're going all the way from, Myanmar to Djibouti. And they're now also up in southern Europe. What are the consequences? Don't you think somebody ought to be thinking about that and trying to figure out how, if at all, we're going to be countering it? There's no business, there's no work being done in this administration. Everybody waits around to see what the latest tweet is or the latest South Lawn, press statement is. That's how policy is being made. And we are going to pay a really big price for that in the years ahead.
That's very well said. Madam Secretary, one of the hardest challenges in foreign policy, again, as you know very well, whether it's dealing with China or anyone else, is how you anchor the pursuit of your interests in the values that matter most to you. And no administration I served in over many years was pristine in this regard. The trade-offs are tough. But I always found that checking your values at the door doesn't usually end well. And one dramatic illustration, at least, of that challenge is our relations with Saudi Arabia today. This is almost exactly the one-year anniversary of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist in a Saudi diplomatic facility in Istanbul. What should we be doing differently in that relationship? And for example, should we be pushing harder for a diplomatic resolution in Yemen, which is both a strategic and a humanitarian catastrophe today?
Well, Bill, you know so much about this region. You served as our ambassador to Jordan. You know all the players. You gain leverage when you speak out about fundamental rights and values. That doesn't mean that merely speaking out is going to cause a sea change in the attitudes of those you are critiquing, but it lays down markers. And for this administration to fail to at all acknowledge the seriousness of a intentional murder of a journalist for criticizing a regime that is a part of our broader reign of influence is not only a big mistake on moral grounds. It's a missed opportunity diplomatically and strategically. You know, we criticize a lot of countries and then we have to do business with them. That's kind of the way it works. But if you don't criticize, you won't even get to do the best kind of business with them. You will lose that leverage. You will lose that credibility. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, to add insult to injury, withdrawing our troops from Syria and then sending several thousand troops to Saudi Arabia could not be a worse message for the United States to send in the entire region. Yemen is a disaster on every front. The amount of just sheer cruel infliction of violence on this population is almost hard to imagine. The human toll is tremendous, and there is no real effort undertaken to try to work out what could possibly be a real end to the hostilities, in part because there's no broker willing to do that. The UN's thrown up its hands. That's a role that we could have and should have played in the past. It's complicated. Look, we had evidence that Iran supported the Houthis before, the Saudis invaded. They were bad actors, and the Houthis had their own interests, and it had to do with, their desire for more autonomy and their dislike of, successive Yemeni regimes after it was unified. And we had to deal with some pretty unsavory characters in order to try to counterbalance the Iranian influence. But I think there has to be an effort at some kind of peacemaking. Maybe there could be, in the absence of American leadership, maybe the UN could try to get back into it, try to get some distinguished, experienced diplomat, somebody to try to begin to get the parties to the table. But the Saudi question is even bigger. Now, I'm sure some of you, as I have met the Crown Prince. He's an impressive, almost charismatic, very self-confident person. And I think that pandering to someone like that is a mistake personally, and it's certainly a mistake diplomatically. I think we had an opportunity to perhaps do more to help guide his ambitions, which were cosmic, and then figure out how to work better with him and his team. But that's been squandered because I think this administration and members of the president's family have been seeking, they've been rent-seeking, basically. They've been seeking financial benefits from Saudis at the highest level. So we got to start somewhere. Yemen might be the best place to start. But anyone who follows foreign affairs has to be worried about the provocation of a military conflict with Iran. And talk about, changing the subject or trying to distract from, current problems. That would be the way to do it. So we all have to watch that closely.
No, I think the danger of collisions in the Gulf right now is very real, and it's growing, and you got mutual enablers in both Washington and Tehran that could take you up a pretty shaky escalatory ladder pretty quickly. Madam Secretary, let me ask you a question about diplomacy. As Secretary of State, you invested heavily in civilian power in both diplomacy and development alongside defense, because we all understand you don't get very far in diplomacy without military and economic leverage. But how do you see the current state of affairs, and what needs to be done, not just to address the problems and the corrosion of the last few years, but to adapt the State Department and American diplomacy for the 21st century?
Well, there's going to be so much damage inherited by whoever comes next as Secretary of State. And you lay that out in your article in Foreign Affairs Bill, and it's really painful reading. anyone who has served in the State Department alongside superb Foreign Service officers like Bill, can't help but be not only saddened, but incredibly enraged at the hollowing out of and destruction of the State Department. People are not applying to take the Foreign Service exam. Young people certainly don't see it as a career that at this time they want to enter, and we had reversed that. I mean, our pipeline was full, and we were recruiting heavily from Americans of different backgrounds who had different language skills. I mean, it was an exciting time when we were there together. And now we are, unfortunately, going to have to rebuild, which is always difficult, and trying to get the resources to do that. But more than that, we have to figure out how to send a message that American diplomacy, in concert with defense and development, is going to be reliable, is going to be looking more to our friends and our allies than to our adversaries for guidance and direction. And it's going to take just Herculean efforts by the team that is put in there after this one hopefully passes to begin to rebuild. When I became Secretary of State, we heard a lot from our Asian friends that they felt totally adrift because the prior administration had spent so much time and effort focused on Iraq and Afghanistan and related issues. And that's why, for my first trip, I went to Asia. And, we didn't have as much to rebuild, but we had problems that we had to come to grips with. We had, statements by Bush administration officials that were very critical, even derogatory of large parts of the world. So we did have to do a lot of rebuilding and a lot of personal outreach. But we were able to sort of turn the corner. As you rightly say, we made our own mistakes and had our own missteps. But this next time is going to be even harder, and the damage is so much deeper. Because even with disagreements that experienced Foreign Service officers had with the Bush administration, I know, because I've seen some of the memos, you put it out there. I mean, you would tell the Secretary of State, you would tell your colleagues, this is a mistake, shouldn't do this, don't go down this path. And I think that's pretty much been squashed. People leave once they reach the point that they feel like they're just whistling in the dark, that nobody is paying attention at all, and they aren't. So that's a fair conclusion to draw. On the development side, we have so much more that we could do to try to alleviate much of the suffering that is coming from particularly the Syrian conflict, made worse now. But we have no spokesperson for that. We have no methodology for linking that with diplomacy. So we pretty much are going to have to rebuild our diplomatic enterprise next time around.
Well, I am determined to try to close on a more uplifting note. So, Madam Secretary, this audience is full of people who've made the cause of peace their life's work, and also filled with many young people who are just beginning their professional journeys. In this era in Washington, just as you pointed out, public service is all too often denigrated and belittled. But what's your message to young people today about public service?
Oh, it's a very heartfelt plea that people really do think about going into public service, including into the Foreign Service. I was at a book signing in Connecticut with my daughter Saturday morning, and a young couple came up before me, and they proudly announced they were Foreign Service officers. They're down the totem pole, so they're not having, the conflicts, they're not being ignored. They've got a job to do, and they are doing it. They just came out of serving together in Laos. They're on their way to Vietnam. And they were still excited, and they were still proud of what they were doing. So I think that there's so much satisfaction in representing our country, what it really stands for, who we not only are, but have to continue to aspire to become. And so I would hope that young people who have an interest in public service, will go into government and will be willing to kind of endure some of the hard times to be able to make a difference. It's a great opportunity, and what is particularly troubling to me is how pessimistic so many Americans are right now. You say end on a note of optimism. Well, you've got to make yourself believe that we can once again do things together, overcome our divides, listen to each other as hard as that might be, trust or try to rebuild trust in our institutions. And one of the characteristics of all the women we write about in this book was their optimism in the face of just terrific obstacles. And I'll just end with just a little story or two, because it sort of epitomizes that optimism. Some of you might have seen the 60 Minutes section on Nadia Murad that was on Sunday night. And Nadia Murad is a Yazidi woman whose village was taken over by ISIS. She, along with all the other women, were sold into slavery to various ISIS fighters, where she was abused repeatedly, but she escaped. And once she escaped, she realized that there were thousands and thousands of women in her very same position, and many of them were not being welcomed back by their families because they had been defiled, and some of them even had become pregnant or had children. And Nadia Murad was determined that she was going to make sure that the voices of these women were heard. So she started speaking out, and she spoke out about things that were not acceptable to speak about. But she never stopped doing it. And she's trying with every ounce of her energy to, help these women have a better future. So when we think about the problems that we are confronting, and not to minimize them, we're in a constitutional crisis, and we have a lot of very difficult questions that we're going to have to figure out how to answer. You have to come to that with a level of optimism that your effort will make a difference. It might not be easy. There may be setbacks. You may try and fail, but you keep getting up and you keep moving forward. And I think in the world in which we find ourselves, you see a little girl like Greta Thunberg with her lonely climate protest, and now millions are doing what she did. And so you can't give up, and you can't decide that there's no role for you to play, because there is. So I would hope that young people see the opportunity for public service as what it is, a determined effort to be optimistic about the future, no matter what. Thanks.
Madam Secretary. I hate to bring this to a close, but I want to thank you very much, Madam Secretary, for reminding all of us, both in this room, in this country, and around the world, reminding all of us so vividly of why we have been so very fortunate to have you in public life over all these years. Thank you very much.